Okay, so tonight we are going to be talking about bears and what we call nature's super sleepers. And what we're going to do, we're going to spend about an hour talking about literally both species of bears, from black bears to brown bears, or what other people call grizzlies, and to learn kind of some of the science behind how bears hibernate and also why bears hibernate. And so hopefully we'll spend an hour. This is a pretty small class. I want it to be informal. We do these classes so you can learn. So if at any point I'm teaching you something about black bear hibernation or bear hibernation that you don't really understand, or you want to ask a question, you can always put it in the chat box. That's kind of what we encourage. I'll try to stop periodically to check that. But if there's something, by all means, let me know if there's something that confuses you, and I'll be happy to straighten you out or to answer your question as best as I can. So again, tonight's class is bears, nature's super sleepers. And what we're going to do is get the slide presentation going forward. Those are the ground rules of the class. I won't go over. We are being recorded, but again, please, please, please ask questions if you have them. Usually what I do for all of these wildlife classes, regardless who is teaching it, whether or not it's myself or we bring in an expert, we always provide their background information, because there's a lot of information out there, especially on social media and the internet, where people come off as being experts in a certain field and they often provide terrible advice. And so for all of our wildlife classes, we want to give a little bit of background information about the presenter. My name is Daryl Radijak. I'm going to be tonight's presenter. And just so you know, most people know who've attended my classes, I've been working with wildlife for about 25 years. And I've worked with many government agencies, from the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency to the U.S. Forest Service to the Bureau of Land Management. And my specialty is those large mammals. And I particularly love the predators. But I've been doing this for a long time, handled and worked with lots of bears. And so the stuff we're going to teach you today is based on science. We don't provide you opinion, what we think's happening. We only present the stuff that we know has been researched and thoroughly vetted by other researchers in the field. So with that, what we're going to do today, like I said, we're going to talk about nature's super sleepers. And we're going to take this peek into bear hibernation. And in order to understand bear hibernation, and just so you know, black bears and brown bears alike, they hibernate during the wintertime. They do it a little bit differently. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to explain that. But before we jump into the actual biology of how bears hibernate, I think it's really important to understand the why, because once you start understanding why things are taking place, then it clicks in your mind. It's easier to remember, it's easier to understand, it's easier to teach other people if you truly know what's going on in that animal's life cycle. And so I want to spend a little bit of time teaching you about why bears hibernate. And the best way to do that is to, first off, start talking about this seasonal cycle. Many animals have this seasonal cycle in which they're doing specific things during different parts of the year. And if you understand a bear's seasonal cycle, you'll soon realize that most everything that they do throughout their life is based on preparing for or coming out of hibernation. So what we want to do is we're going to focus on a bear's life, and we're going to go through the 4 seasons. Where we'll start for this one is we're going to start in spring and then go through summer, fall, and we're going to end up in winter, because winter is when those bears are hibernating. And to understand why bears are doing that in the wintertime, you kind of got to look at everything else that's going on throughout the year. So let's start, first of all, with this spring season. And let's look at the main activities of bears. And again, this is going to be both black bears and brown bears. I'm going to have a mixture of pictures in there, but they apply to both species of bears in North America. Though there's 3 species, but we're not talking about polar bears today. And so if you look at the springtime and what's going on in a bear's life, obviously in the early spring, we have what's called den emergence. This is where bears are coming out of hibernation. They're emerging from the den, whether or not it's a cave, a tree, whatever crevice they have found to spend the winter. They emerge from the den, and it's going to vary throughout the geographic areas when bears are emerging from their winter slumber. But that's the first sign of spring, is when bears come out of their den. Now, many of you know that when bears do come out, the female bears oftentimes are toting cubs behind them. That is because those females give birth during the middle of their hibernation while they're tucked away in their den. And we're going to talk more in depth about that. But one of the cool things is when those female bears emerge with cubs, obviously one of the highest priorities in that female bear's mind is keeping her cubs alive. So she's going to spend quite a great deal of time caring for those cubs. In fact, she's going to spend literally the next year and a half watching out for her offspring. And as you can imagine, once a bear emerges from the den, whether or not it's a male single bear or a female with cubs, they have been sleeping for quite some time. They haven't eaten, they haven't drinking, they haven't they haven't drank anything in sometimes months and months on end. So when they emerge from the den, they're famished. And what they're doing, they're just looking for calories. They're looking for anything to eat. Now, one thing you have to remember is in that early spring, we're talking March, April, even early May, sometimes there's not a lot of food out there because the spring green up has not occurred. And so occasionally during the early spring, when bears are first emerging from their den and they're really having a hard time finding food, unfortunately, you get a lot of those negative interactions with bears where bears sometimes get into trouble because they're looking for food because they haven't eaten in a long time. Now, thankfully, they do get some respite. As soon as that spring green up happens, it's literally an overnight bounty of food. When the grasses bloom, the leaves bloom, when everything blooms in the summertime, it's immediate food for the bears, because bears, as most people know, they're not carnivores, they're classified as omnivores. And so they will eat both meat and vegetable. So much so that most of their diet is 90% vegetable matter. And so they will be eating grasses, they will be eating leaves, they will be eating mushrooms, they'll be eating anything that they could find that is growing in the springtime. Obviously, mushrooms aren't grown in the springtime, but for the most part, that spring green up brings food, but it's not really, really nutritious food. It's enough to sustain them, to make them happy, give them a full belly. But it's like you're starving to death and you get a salad bar and all you have is salad. There's no real nutritious, high calorie foods there. But like I said, it is enough to sustain them. And so bears in the springtime are doing a lot of eating. They're trying to gain back the weight that they lost during that hibernation. And so sometimes, like I said, they do get in trouble because they're looking for that calorically rich foods, which are not in abundance in nature at that point. So surviving the spring, it's fairly easy once green up happens, and that takes them on into the summertime. And so if you look what happens in the summertime, remember, bears are hungry. Their stomach pretty much drives what they do. And fortunately, in the summertime, they do get a big break, because what happens in the summer is you finally get some of those more nutritious foods. And in particular, what I'm talking about is the berry crop. Now, I will tell you, there's a lot of biology nerds out there that like talking to people and like trying to show off in front of people, and they'll talk in jargon. They'll use some terms that they're familiar with that the general public sometimes is not. And so if you ever hear someone talking about the soft mast crop, what they're talking about is the berry crop. The mast crop is kind of like the fruiting body of a plant. And so soft mast are berries, hard mast are acorns or nuts. And we'll talk more about that in the fall. But for the most part, in the summertime, the bears are finally getting back to health. They've kind of put some of the weight back on, but now that that berry crop has come about, they're going to spend most of their time eating berries. And believe it or not, that bear in the bottom left, that is not a young grizzly. That's actually a Western black bear, because they do come in coats of many colors. So anyway, The other big thing, besides eating, besides gorging themselves on berries, something really special happens in the summertime, early summertime. And that's when Barry White gets on the radio and starts singing his love songs, and bears go through their mating season. And so what's going to happen doesn't matter if it's black bear or brown bear. The females, the single females that go into heat are going to draw males in, and those bears are going to mate, usually sometimes around late June, all the way throughout the month of July. And so what happens is when that adult male and female bear get together, and they do the act, the egg is going to get fertilized. But here's what happens. Usually in mammals or in reproductive process of mammals, as soon as fertilization takes place, those eggs start to grow within the animal's womb. But that doesn't happen with bears. The male and female will get together, those eggs will get fertilized, but the female's body will pretty much call a timeout. They're not going to let those eggs start developing within her womb. And guess what, folks? It's related to hibernation, and you'll see why in a little bit. So anyway, mating takes place. Lots of food out there with the berry crops. The bears are doing pretty good, surviving just well. And so this takes them into the fall. And guess what? Fall marks the time period just before hibernation. So they're going to have to gorge themselves on food in order to pack on enough weight to survive the hibernation. And so oftentimes during the fall, you're going to see bears, their diet's going to switch from that soft mast into what we call hard mast. And I mentioned it before, it's the nut crop. Whether or not it's acorns or hickory nuts or any other type of nut that is produced by a tree, those things are usually power-packed, nutritious pellets for the bears. And so they will absolutely focus on that hard mass crop in order to gain the calories, to gain the fat layer that they need in order to survive the hibernation. Now, obviously, bears do eat meat, and one of the things you often see, especially if you watch Discovery TV, you'll see brown bears fishing in the river, taking advantage of those salmon runs or those trout runs. And so obviously they serve the same function, whether or not it's a black bear eating acorns or the grizzlies or brown bears eating the huge supply of fish that comes inland. The goal here is to pack on enough weight to survive that winter. Now, the cool thing that happens in the fall, remember the mating that took place? Male and female bear got together. And what has happened is that female bear who has these fertilized eggs within her womb, she's trying to prepare for the hibernation, and she has to put on layers of fat in order to survive that hibernation. But what happens if a bear goes into the den underweight, does not have the layers of fat to survive the hibernation, it could probably survive. It might leave the den in search of food. It can probably last with whatever reserves it has. But if you put an underweight bear that is also pregnant, that is going to give birth to cubs, then there's a really, really good chance that not only the cubs won't survive, but the mom won't survive because it's too taxing on the bear's body. And so what a bear's body does in the fall, usually around November, all of this is based on photo period, but their body starts triggering. If it's a female bear, it kind of starts they don't do it consciously, but their body checks to see if it has enough fat on it. Now, if the female bear does have enough fat to survive not only the hibernation, but the upcoming pregnancy, then her eggs will implant on the uterine wall. And as soon as they implant on the uterine wall, they're going to begin to get nourished, and those eggs are going to grow into a young fetus, into a young baby bear, whatever species it is. Now, if that female bear is underweight, and there's a chance that that bear would not survive the hibernation and not survive the pregnancy on top of that, then what that bear is going to do, her body's going to reabsorb those eggs, and she just won't get pregnant that year. And so even though they've been fertilized and she mated months beforehand, those eggs, those little embryos will not start growing until her body is sure that it's going to be able to survive not just the hibernation, but the pregnancy. And that whole process, if you've seen my classes before, that whole process is called delayed implantation, but it's an evolutionary process to make sure that the female bears survive both the hibernation and the pregnancy. So that's going to take us, where's my button here? That's going to take us towards this winter time. So the bears, they came out in the springtime. They're pretty hungry because they slept for a while. They started eating whatever they could find, mostly vegetation, grasses, whatever green stuff is grown in that spring green up. Summertime, they finally get some berries to eat. They do some mating. Fall, they get more nutritious foods with the mast crop, the nut crop or acorn crop, or those big heavy salmon runs if you're a brown bear. And it's always allowing that bear to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, put on those layers of fat so they can survive the hibernation. And so for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to actually talk about the hibernation and what's going on. But looking at the bear's life cycle, that seasonal cycle, you see the way that they eat throughout the year, a lot of it is based on what their body goes through in the wintertime. And like I said, in that wintertime, we're talking about hibernation. So that lends the question, why do bears and other animals, but why do bears sleep through the winter? Well, it's really easy. A lot of people will see this photo and they're like, oh, it's a way to survive the winter times, they'll hibernate to get past all the snow. And it's not that. What hibernation is, it's an adaptation to survive long periods without food. It's not based on snow, because even if there's no snow, many bears will hibernate. But what usually happens in the wintertime, doesn't matter what latitude you're at. Well, it does matter what latitude you're at, but here in North America, even if you live in, say, the Southeast, where it tends to be fairly warm in the wintertime, you still have a dormant time where the leaves fall off the trees, the grasses and plants stop growing, pretty much everything dies out for a couple of months. And if you looked at that bear's life cycle, it was based on eating plant material, whether or not it was grasses, berry crops, acorn crops. That was all food that was plant-based. Now, I will tell you, bears will eat meat whenever they find it, but they don't consist on eating meat. They're not true carnivores. They depend mostly on that vegetable matter. And so in the wintertime, in most latitudes, most geographic regions of North America, there's going to be a period of time where there's really no nutritious foods. Even, like I said, even in the Southeast, yeah, you might not have snow, but you're not going to have a lot of good nutritious food. Dead and dying leaves don't provide sustenance for an animal. And so just so you know, if you look at how other animals survive through the wintertime, you have birds. Once wintertime hits and there's no food available, birds migrate to where there's food. Believe it or not, well, animals like deer, believe it or not, they shift their diet from eating grasses and fresh growth to browsers. They will eat mostly buds on trees throughout the wintertime. And so it's an amazing adaptation that animals go through, that their bodies go through in order to survive long periods without nutritious foods being out there. Now, the evolutionary adaptation that bears took on and many other animals is this idea or this concept of hibernation. And so what they'll do is, since there's no food out there, you know what? We're going to go dormant. We're going to sleep most of the time throughout the winter. We're going to shut our bodies down so we can survive this very desperate time where there's no food resources. And so that is the main reason why animals hibernate. It's because the food resources are no longer there. So the next question is, when do they sleep? When do bears go into hibernation? Now, I mentioned in North America, pretty much most bears all throughout North America will hibernate. I will have people argue with me in the Southeast to say bears and the Smokies don't hibernate. They do. I've been in multiple bear dens while they were hibernating. But how the geographic location affects hibernation is usually the duration of their hibernation. So obviously, if you're far up north, you're Alaska, Canada, you have pretty severe winters. They're going to last from pretty much October all the way to April. Now, the further south you go, the less severe that winter is. So folks in the southeast, they're still going to have a hibernation period, the bears are, but that period is going to be much shorter. The bears might not go into den until December, sometimes even January, and they might only sleep maybe 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. So their hibernation period is much, much shorter than those of the more northern latitudes. Now, I will tell you, there was one really, really large study that was called the Tri-State Bear Study, and it involved Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia. Is one of the largest bear studies. Took place late 1970s, all through the 80s. Dr. Michael Pelton led most of that. And what they discovered is really interesting because it truly benefited the way we manage bears. And so what they found out is those female bears that were pregnant that were pregnant and due to have cubs, they usually entered the den first. Usually sometime in November, late November, they would start going to den. The male bears were the ones that entered the den last. They would typically enter the den about a month, maybe even 6 weeks after the female bears. And how is that really important? Well, once we learn that facet of information, one of the things that state wildlife agencies did to protect the bears, because there's a lot of states that have bear hunting, what they did is they would push the bear hunting seasons later and later in the year to make sure the females would have time to go into den, and it would protect that breeding source. And so the focus of those hunting seasons ended up being on the male bears, which when it comes to growing a population, the females are the most important aspect of that population. And so that little bit of information from that tri-state bear study really helped state wildlife agencies throughout the southeast, throughout North America, literally adapt better to making sure they protect the resource, even though those animals are hunted. Okay, we talked about when they sleep. Again, more northern latitudes, they're going to sleep a lot longer, go into den a lot earlier, and emerge from the den a lot later. So where do bears sleep? Well, most people generally think bears will sleep in a cave. And so I have this picture here, and I laugh at this picture. I don't know why it reminds me of Scooby-Doo so much, but like a cave that you could walk in with a flashlight and go way back in. That's what many people think caves are like. And the problem is bears don't like those kind of caves, because when it comes for a place to sleep in the wintertime, there are certain preferences that bears have. For example, they want their den or their sleeping area to be really, really tight and really, really dry. Now, why is this? It's pretty simple. They're going to be spending the next couple of months during some really, really, really cold weather. And so they do it to conserve heat. Because if a bear was to use a cave like you see on the screen, the air is going to be circulating all around them. Who knows if water can get in there. It's not going to be a really good place for them to hibernate if they cannot conserve their body heat. And so typically when you look at a cave that a bear may hibernate in, this is what you're looking at. It's something that a lot of people would walk right on by, not realizing that a bear could hibernate in there. And so you're looking for a hole that's big enough for a bear to get its head and neck in. If it can get its head and neck in, it's going to squeeze its body in, but they want to crawl up in there, and they want that crevice. They want that den site to be really tight, so they can conserve their body heat as they tuck themselves in there. And so, you know what? If if something in the ground will suit their needs like that, guess what, folks? There's a lot of black bears, especially, that will actually hibernate in trees. Sometimes that hole is at the base of the tree or underneath maybe the root system. Believe it or not, there are some bears that will actually find these den sites that are high up in a tree. A lot of the trees, especially those deciduous trees in the eastern half of the US, they're susceptible to what we call a heart fungus. And so the inside of the tree might rot out. But if you remember back to your basic science classes, when a tree is growing, the live part of that tree is the outside, the bark and that cambium layer, and that innermost core of that tree is already dead. And so even though they have these holes in the tree is still alive, still growing, but it provides some wonderful, wonderful den sites for the bears. And so for the most part, the bears will find these places. When it comes to brown bears or grizzlies, as some people call them, a lot of times those bears will actually excavate their den site. They'll climb up high on a mountain, find an area on the side of the mountain, and grizzlies have an adaptation that's a little bit different than black bears, but they have these really long and powerful claws. Black bear claws are designed for climbing. Grizzly claws are designed for digging. So many times grizzlies or those brown bears will dig out their den site. They'll find a suitable area and then spend the next couple hours or even a day or two excavating a den site for them to sleep in. So den selection is really, really important. Remember, they want to find some really tight, cramped areas so they can spend their winter nice and warm. All right, that's going to lead us to probably the most important question for tonight. And it all involves about hibernation is, how do they do it? How do bears hibernate? How do they sleep for so long and survive as they do? And here's the dilemma, folks. Remember, this animal, this large mammal, is going to go into a den and it's trying to survive a period where there's no really good food sources out there. So the bear's body has to figure out how to stay alive without food or water for months on end. And I'm going to cough. Excuse me. So that's a really big problem. As a large mammal, we have these caloric needs just to keep our bodies alive and healthy. And here it is, a bear, which is typically much larger than a human, is now going to stop eating and drinking for sometimes months on end, especially those northern climates. They might hibernate for 4 months, possibly 5 months. But even in those more southern regions, if a bear is going to hibernate or not eat or drink for 6 weeks or 2 months, if we don't eat or drink, we're going to die, especially the not drinking. So the dilemma is, how can a body do that? How can a bear do that and still stay alive? And so we're going to get into the science, but I like doing analogies to help you understand the science, because I'm not one of those brilliant people that think in science terms. I'm a simple-minded person that can understand science because I put it in terms that make more sense to me. And so what we're going to talk about is not bears, but we're going to talk about cars. And so here's an analogy I propose. You have a car. I don't care what kind of car it is. You have a car, truck, whatever you want, an automobile to drive you around. And you take that automobile and you take it to the gas station and you fill it up. You put as much gas in there as possible. Remember, that gas is kind of going to be the energy that that car needs in order to run. So really simple question, and I'm sure y'all can answer it no problem, is when would that car conserve more gas? While it's running, how do you keep as much gas in that car as possible? So which is the best way to conserve that fuel that that car needs to keep running? Is it driving that car 90 miles an hour, driving it 30 miles an hour, or just keeping that car idling? Well, obviously, that's a really simple question. We all know about cars and automobiles. If you want to keep that car running the longest and keep the gas in there the longest time, you don't go full bore driving it as fast as you can. You don't even go driving it. You more or less just let it sit there and idle, because that idling does not conserve, or it does not burn up a lot of fuel. It can stay running for a long, long time. Yeah, you might have to rev it now and then, but it can idle for much longer than it could if that car was running at 90 miles an hour or even 30 miles an hour. And so that's the best way to conserve the energy that's within that car. So let's now talk about bears. And instead of conserving gas, what we're going to be talking about is metabolism, the energy that it takes to keep that bear alive. And so what's really, really cool, all animals have this metabolism. It's kind of like the basic amount of energy that's required in order to keep you alive. Now, obviously, if you're really active and doing lots of things, your metabolism is a lot higher. You're burning more energy. And so the key here, the trick here is, how do we kick the body into this idling mode so our metabolism drops so we're not burning energy? So let's look at some really cool facets of hibernation. And we're going to talk about another animal really quickly. We're going to talk about a groundhog. Now, a groundhog is what we call a true hibernator. This is how most animals hibernate. Not all animals, but how most animals hibernate. And we call them true hibernators, because what's going to happen is, in the wintertime, when there's no food out there, they're going to try to shut their body down because they don't want to burn a lot of energy. And so if you look at an animal like a groundhog, its heart rate is going to drop to just a few beats per minute. So really, really slow heart rate. Its respiration rate is going to be almost negligible. You can barely even know that it's breathing. It's only going to be a few breaths per minute. Here's the really interesting, with a groundhog and other hibernating animals, their body temperature drops like crazy. It drops to just above freezing. Y'all know 32 degrees Fahrenheit is freezing. And so a lot of these animals, their body temperature drops to just above freezing. They're almost like frozen icicles. And so I just got to check that, because sometimes people will say, hey, just want to know you dropped off your call. Okay. All right, I'm still live. I had one class where I got a text say, you know that your internet cut out. Okay, we're still doing good. So talking about those true hibernators, they're like frozen little popsicles that are sometimes sleeping underground. They're just above freezing. And what's crazy is when they do that, when they drop their heart rate and they drop their respiration rate and they drop their body temperature, their metabolism will drop about 50% for every 20 degrees Fahrenheit that their body temperature drops. So you think an animal is almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 97, 98, kind of like humans. So they drop 20 degrees, there's 50%. So that would take them around 70. They drop another 20 degrees, and then another 20 degrees. So when they get to that 35, 36 degree mark, their metabolism has dropped 87%. So it costs very, very little in energy to keep them alive. So their fat reserves can keep them alive for a long time without doing anything. The weird thing with those guys, because their body temperature has dropped so much, they're in this frozen coma-like state. So the best way I can describe it is, you find a ground squirrel or groundhog or one of these true hibernating animals in the middle of winter, you can pull it out of its den, you can kick it across the floor, you can don't kick it across the floor, but that animal is not going to wake up. It's going to take that animal probably a day or so in order to wake up, because they got to slowly bring their body temperature up. And this is going to take a long, long time for them to bring their body temperature up before they're fully functioning again. And so that's how many of the hibernators work. So now let's talk about the bear, what we call the super hibernator. They do things a little bit differently when they hibernate. And it's really, really awesome because watch this. When a bear hibernates, its heart rate is going to drop to just a few beats per minute. Its respiration is also going to drop so you can barely tell that that animal is breathing. But this is what separates bears from most other hibernating animals. Their body temperature drops to only about 92 degrees. So it only drops maybe 8, 9, 10 degrees. And so they're still really, really warm. And this is why we call them super sleepers. They're literally just asleep, barely breathing, heart rate slows, but their body temperature, they're still, I don't want to say smoking hot, but they're still very, very warm. So they can wake up rather easily. This process is sometimes described as torpor, T-O-R-P-O-R. And this is where those confusing articles have really messed people up because they think it's, oh, that's not hibernation. It is. That torpor is often called hibernation light. It's just a different way of hibernating. And so the crazy thing with that is when you look at their metabolic function, even though the bear has only dropped about 10 degrees and can wake up almost instantaneously, their metabolism has dropped 75%. So they're barely burning any energy. And they have those fat layers to keep them going, to keep them sleeping through the wintertime without any ill effects to their body. And so instead of being in that frozen coma-like state, the bears are more or less in this warm sleeping state. So like I said, you can actually go into their den and they will wake up, and they will wake up rather quickly. So that is the main difference between that true hibernating animal and a bear, which we call a super hibernator, or they do this torpor, which is called hibernation light. So why is this so amazing? Well, you have to think about this. If we knew the answers to some of the ways that bears especially can survive the winter time, it's truly fascinating. Because when bears emerge from their den, they may have lost about 30% of their body weight. So think about it. A 200-pound animal can go into the den, come out weighing about 130, 140 pounds. So it lost 60 pounds by just sleeping through the wintertime. What's amazing about that is they lose pretty much all fat, hardly any muscle loss. So think of the repercussions or ramifications if we could figure out how that happens. Could you imagine right now, knowing what you weigh, you got to lose weight. I got to lose weight. Can you imagine, you know what? I'm going to go sleep for a couple of weeks. And when I wake up, I'm going to lose all fat, no muscle. And so when I wake up, I'm going to be in much better shape than when I went to bed. That would be fascinating. We can't figure out how bears are able to do that. The other thing that's truly amazing is when they are hibernating, they oftentimes, they don't urinate or defecate. And this takes place for months on end, especially in those more northern latitudes. And what happens is this fecal plug will form in the bear's digestive tract. And what that fecal plug is, the inside lining of the intestines kind of sloughs off, and it just forms this blockage towards the back end of the bear, this fecal plug. And so it helps them not have to urinate or defecate for months on end. The best part about this, even though they're not eating, they're still producing, they're burning energy, they're producing waste products that then get recycled by the kidneys. And this is that medical miracle, because if humans or other animals don't defecate, their bodies will poison themselves because they can't recycle that waste product. Yet bears can do that. And last but not least, what's so amazing is during the middle of the hibernation, the females will give birth. Now, don't think that they're sleeping. They don't even realize that they give birth. Bears periodically will wake up while they're sleeping. Like I said, they maintain that high body temperature so they can wake up rather easily. So when a female bear is given birth, she gives birth to cubs usually around the month of January or February. She's going to give birth to a litter of cubs, anywhere from 1 to 3 cubs. Imagine how nice that would be. Again, relating that to humans, can you imagine going to sleep, waking up much skinnier, or waking up, if you were a female, waking up and already having given birth? It sure would be nice to be a bear. And so the cool thing with bears is bear hibernation remains one of those great medical mysteries. And so we're still researching it, still trying to figure out what's going on. But it's a truly fascinating fact of life how bears are able to survive this winter hibernation. All right. So we're going to talk real briefly about and then there were cubs, because I mentioned female bears give birth during the middle of the hibernation. Just so you know, I took that picture. That was one of the cubs I fostered out when I was working at the Appalachian Bear Center in East Tennessee. Anyway, when the female gives birth, there's some really, really cool things about birth. Remember, cubs are going to be born late January to early February, and they're really, really tiny. Now, the reason they're tiny, remember I was explaining that delayed implantation? The female's body is waiting to see if she'll survive the hibernation. So those eggs, those fertilized eggs do not implant into the uterine wall until, say, around November. And then they're born in February. So they only have what, November, end of November, yeah, you have December and January. They got about 2.5, maybe 3 months of growing. Think of a human baby. They grow inside the mom's womb for 9 months. But the bear, they're only growing inside the mother's uterus for about 3 months. So when bears give birth, they're tiny. In fact, they have the smallest birth weight compared to live weight in the entire mammal kingdom. Now, typically when they're born, it's anywhere from 1 to 3 cubs. Usually the healthier or the fatter the mom, the more cubs she's going to give birth to. Because again, through that delayed implantation process, what she'll see is, hey, my body will survive 1 cub, but there's no way my body will survive having 3 or 4 cubs. So they may abort or reabsorb some of those eggs and only allow 1 or 2 to implant. So the more fat layers she has, the healthier she is, the more cubs she will give birth to. Again, moms will wake up periodically. They will clean the cubs. They will shift around, make sure that the cubs are doing okay, but then she's right back to sleep. So the cool thing is by April, those cubs are ready to greet the world. And so it's a pretty fascinating time, even though the general public doesn't see what's going on in a bear's life, and scientists don't see what's going on in a bear's life for the most part, because they're tucked away in that den for months on end, but a lot of things are happening. Now, how do we know all this? How do we know what's going on inside the den? Well, don't ask, because it's really, really cool. And it's something that I got a chance to do. That's not me. That's one of my buddies, Dr. Carl Malcolm, who researched bears in Wisconsin. I will tell you a really cool thing. He gave me this picture of him climbing in a bear den. When it comes to the mother's giving birth, bear milk, mom's going to continue to sleep through her hibernation. Although she does wake up periodically, the cubs, on the other hand, they're going to be nursing. They're going to be sleeping and eating and sleeping. And so the goal of the cub is, when they're born really tiny, usually about a half a pound, they got to like, not even quite, they got to grow about 10 times what they're born at before they emerge from the den. And so they're going to be drinking off of mom's milk. And mom's milk is just crazy nutritious. It's something like 4 times higher fat content than regular cow milk. So regular cow's milk, you're looking at, I believe it's 4 or 5% fat content, where the female bear is producing 20 to 24% fat content. To give you an idea what that means, Dr. Malcolm here, he told me at one time he was inside a bear den and the mother was sedated, and the cubs were nursing off her, and she exuded some of the bear milk onto his arm. And he said, it was amazing, Daryl. He said, as soon as that the bear milk hit the cold air, it was turning into butter. He said it was so thick, it was almost like there was butter on his arms. And so, anyway, really cool thing. Another reason why bears are so awesome. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this thing up, and then I'll answer whatever questions you may have about bear hibernation. So, in summary, I'm going to keep this really simple. Bears, they're unlike any other animal. They are truly unique. They're truly nature's super sleepers. The way they hibernate is so different than most other hibernators. They take advantage of that torpor, that hibernation light, but they do spend quite a bit of time sleeping throughout the wintertime, yet their body is able to keep them alive. So with that, I'm going to hold off on questions really quick. I got to go through a couple more slides, and then I will be here to answer whatever questions you have. So my presentations are lousy without any good pictures. I got one of my favorite photographers, Bob Howdeshell, gives me a lot of photos, but a lot of these other folks truly help me out with my presentations. If you're new to these Wildlife for You webinars, we have a website that's getting a little outdated, but it's www.wildlifeforyou.com. We also do a podcast. It's been put on hold for about 6 or 8 months now. Myself and Stephanie Payne, we do a podcast that's available on lots of different platforms. We've got like 80 episodes you can listen to. But the best way to follow us to know when the next classes are coming up is to follow us on Facebook. And so you just look up Wildlife for You on Facebook. And that's where I talk about upcoming classes, anything that's interesting. Now, I will say, mark your calendars, even though I messed up last week because I forgot about this conference I have to go to next week. The next class we will be teaching, and I promise you it will be the next class, it's going to be about endangered species and how we save them from extinction. So it's going to talk about the Endangered Species Act, a lot about what kind of animals out there that are endangered, and how we go about saving them. And so that will be a good class. It'll probably be less than 2 weeks from today, not next Tuesday, but the following Tuesday is when I anticipate putting that on. But I will send everyone an email when that class will be taking place, or like I said, just follow along on our Facebook page. So with that, I always tell you that wildlife is awesome, but remember, when it comes to wildlife, it's your knowledge that often means their existence. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I will sit here and answer whatever questions you have about bear hibernation. Okay, Evelyn McGarry asked if NASA is studying bear hibernation for space exploration. Absolutely. It's probably not just NASA. I know there's a number of research facilities. Obviously, what they can find out regarding bear hibernation and how it works and whether or not it can be applied to human patients is definitely something they're looking forward or looking into regarding space travel, because as you know, getting from point A to point B, when you're dealing with space, sometimes may take years and years or sometimes decades. And if they can figure out how to induce a hibernation-like state, I wouldn't want to be the guinea pig that volunteered for that particular space travel. But yes, a lot of that research is trying to figure out whether or not we can induce that hibernation-like state in humans. So very, very good question. Does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to unmute your microphone if you don't feel like typing anything, but I'm happy to stick around. If not, I will say thank you so much for joining in on this presentation. That the recording of this will be available. Now, we do have memberships that people apply for, so they're the ones that get those recordings. But by all means, if you have any questions that pop up later on, you feel free to ask them on Facebook or anywhere else. Try to get a hold of me, and I'm happy to answer your questions. So with that, I do want to thank you for joining in tonight. You're the reason why we do these presentations, is because like I said, your knowledge often is so extremely important to keeping these animal species alive. So with that, I will bid you farewell and you have a good night. And thank you for everything.
Hey, Daryl,
Yes.
Patricia here. Just two quick questions. Thanks for those IDs on the snakes for me.
No problem.
What makes it a gray snake as opposed to a black rat snake?
Um, can I tell a little secret?
Yeah.
I'm not the best with snake IDs, so when you sent me that photo, I sent it to a snake specialist, and he was
Okay.
the one that ID'd it. I would have to look, but honestly, Patricia, I think what it mostly boils down to is geographic location. They're obviously the same species. It'll just be a different variety. The gray rat snake versus the black rat snake. And so same species, it's generally different geographic location is what differentiates them most of the time.
So we here in East Tennessee, then we would likely have gray rats as opposed to
Yes.
black rats.
Yes. And
Okay, didn't know
I
that.
would look that up. If you want to look it up, that's what you'll probably
Yeah.
find is the geographic range of those different varieties, those different subspecies is, and there might be subtle morphological differences that a snake specialist would be able to look at. But
Okay.
for the most part, oh, if you're in this part of the country, it's this type of rat snake.
Yeah.
If you're over here, it's this kind of rat snake.
Okay.
So I know.
Thanks. The reason I ask is I was at one of the sandpack classes when we saw those two snakes,
Yep.
and somebody said it was a black rat, which is why that's why I tended towards the black rat. And I don't remember exactly who it was that, had stated that that's what it was.
Yeah, and the one thing I found out when it comes to subspecies, I'm one of those. I'm more of a lumper than a splitter, and I know people really like getting into the fine details. But what I've learned throughout my career is I'm not going to argue with anyone if they if they say it's this subspecies. It's not going to just go with it. So
Right.
yeah, if you know someone who knows snakes better and that's what they say, like I said, I wouldn't argue with them. But a rat snake is a certain species. They're harmless. They're wonderful to have around, and
Yeah.
I wish we had more of them. So
Yeah. Okay. Second question. Have you ever done anything, any programs on the bears of the world, the 8 bears of the world?
yeah. Have you not seen that presentation?
No, I haven't. I'll have to check and see whether or not it's one that was in the list.
I'll send it to you.
Okay.
I haven't done that one in probably 4 years, but
Okay.
there was a presentation is called Bears of the World.
Okay. All right. The reason I ask is the K8 team did one